Then we'll go to what is the core of my argument, which is how humans create categories. All of our talking, all of our writing, all of our thinking is based on categories. So how do we transform patterns that we see around us into categories that can actually function in our thinking? And from there, we're going to talk a little bit about the sustainability or not of our future and what is needed in this categorization system to actually manage a sustainable future. And then I end up with going a little bit further outward from the categories to the narratives that are based on those categories. And with that, I will then conclude my talk. So, questions, definitions, and approach. Why is it so difficult, and that is the origin of our work, to respond to all the anthropogenic change that we have affected in the environment? I've been in this game more or less since 1980, and I've seen how very rapidly climate change became a huge industry. Hundreds of millions of dollars a year are spent on the environmental aspects of climate change, whether it's the weather, the climate, the biology, the demography, all those different aspects. As I was myself a social scientist, I came at it from a different angle. And for the first 20 years, that was a great frustration for me, because I couldn't really interact with the people who were thinking and working on the actual environmental aspects of climate change. And so it was a great relief when sort of around 2010, that changed and the wind started blowing in a different direction. And people began to see climate change as anthropogenically generated and therefore dependent on societal dynamics. And that is the angle that I will take in this particular talk. And so it is society and society's collective decision-making that, in my mind, actually is responsible for the future of the climate, for the future of our environment. So there's a typo in there, but you can forget about that one. So for me, the societal dynamics are the core of what this is all about. And in looking at the situation right now, partly as a heritage of the long advance that the environmental sciences had, we see that most of the arguments are actually proximate arguments. They're arguments about immediate causalities. They're arguments that are very much focused on individual domains. There is an energy debate. There is a future security debate. There is a water security debate. But there is not very much that goes beyond that. And so what I'm going to try and do in this particular talk is achieve maybe laying the basis for a more sort of ultimate causes-based argument. The ones that we have so far are not particularly specific. There's basically the eternal complaint of the absence of political will. There's the eternal complaint that we're stuck in a capitalist economic system. Those things don't, in the end, get to the point why we don't react. And that is what I would like to do in the rest of my talk. So what is an illusion of control? As far as I was able to trace, the first mention of the illusion of control was a psychologist, a man called Langer, who basically said, proven solutions are often extended to other problems. That's relatively academic language. What I like best comes out of a novel by Michener, the belief that if you wish strong enough, you can hold the flow of change. I think that is a lot of what the illusion of control actually is about. It occurs when one attempts to control partly understood changes in a system's environment by applying inappropriate measures. And we'll get to the point of appropriateness or not. The illusion of control is a frequent reaction to part understood tipping points. Tipping points are another concept that has come into our vocabulary over the last 20 years. And very often what we see is that when a system reaches close to a tipping point, people start frantically looking at the illusion of control and maintaining that illusion. I would argue that this is one of the main dilemmas that the world is facing right now. We are under an illusion of control as far as the climate is concerned, and we are also under an illusion of control with environmental and social change more widely. For me, that is symbolized by the answer I get when people raise the issue that they say, okay, innovation will get us out of trouble. And my answer is, well, if we look at that, 250 years of innovation is actually what has got us into trouble over the last 2.5 centuries. And that is the dilemma that we're now facing. So in the last period since the Second World War, many people have lived a relative stability. And living in France and having to deal right now with some of the social upsets there, in particular this retirement business, it's very interesting to see how 70 years of maintaining an illusion actually then makes it very, very difficult to effect any changes. The illusion has been that people could retire at 55, could retire at 60, could retire at 62. That turns out, dynamically, economically, to become impossible because of what is happening in other parts of the world. And so as a result, the French resist that change, which has occurred everywhere else in Europe. So that is also what I mean by an illusion of control. So I want to cite a few people who, for me, have been important. And I can only begin with the traditional quote by Einstein: we cannot solve the problems we have by applying the thinking that was responsible for creating them. But I was very influenced by Nicholas Taleb. He is originally a stockbroker. And so he had to deal a lot of times with the unexpected, with risks, with uncertainties. And so he argues that the overconfidence in our knowledge and in our judgment is fed by the illusory certainty of hindsight. And I will get back to that because for me, hindsight plays a very important role in maintaining the illusion of control. Daniel Kahneman, the cognitive scientist, initially in 2011 said excessive confidence in what we believe we know, which is not that different from the illusory certainty of hindsight. And the apparent inability to acknowledge the full extent of our ignorance, and that is another important part of this, because the knowledge systems that we develop are actually very partial. And what we don't generally acknowledge is that we mostly don't know things. And then a much later and not written statement by Kahneman at a symposium at the Santa Fe Institute, which I think is a very interesting addition to this whole perspective, is that people believe the reasons because they believe in the conclusions. And that if you try and undermine those conclusions by giving good scientific reasons, that actually doesn't work. And the illusion and the causality is therefore reversed. So that's, why is it an illusion? Well, the map is not the landscape, and Jan already mentioned those two things. The map is a simplification that leaves out many of the dimensions, even the very famous French Michelin maps, which have much more detail than most other maps in most parts of the country, actually have a selection of those things. And there's actually quite important geographical tenets about how many things you can include on a map and how many you cannot include on a map. So any kind of human solution to a challenge is a simplification. It is a simplification of nested, scalar complex dynamics. And the limited cognitive dimensions of the solutions that we devise are, of course, after they're being implemented, confronted with much more complex reality. And it's that discrepancy between the dimensionality of our comprehension and the model that we create in our minds and the actual complexity of the phenomena concerned that makes it so difficult and makes why the map is never going to tell us exactly what is going on. And so applying the map to understand the landscape results in what I call unanticipated consequences. Confronting the low-dimensional model, the human solution, with the high-dimensional reality generates those unintended consequences. And I published a number of years ago a paper that is simply called Solutions Cause Problems. And I think that is what the essence of this argument is. So ignoring those unanticipated consequences is maintaining the illusion of stability and control. But ultimately, it's always shattered. And I may, if I have time, go back to that point later on the talk. So some examples, and you all know these because they've been bandied about all over the place. Health, the COVID, after we have dismantled much of the health system. In France, when I was living there at the beginning of the epidemic, the government very solemnly said, masks are totally useless. Why did they say that? Because they had just burned 1.5 billion of them. I came from Japan and basically said, well, if a whole society like Japan likes masks, I'm also going to use masks. I had a few of them and I used those for about 6 months until finally in France you could get masks in a pharmacy. I don't even have to talk very much about politics. We see very much how over the last year and a half, things have completely changed and an illusion of control that we had about a peaceful Europe has been shattered. The war in Ukraine, the energy debate. I would argue the energy debate as in a dead-end situation because both the fossil energy community and the community on renewable energy have driven each other to the point where they can't move anymore and where anything intermediate is becoming very, very difficult. That is creating on both sides an illusion of control, and in neither side does that actually work. On climate, I don't have to say much more than that. So to my mind, in all these cases, the illusion of control has hindered effective responses to each of those conundrums. So now we get to the point of information processing, but I'm first going to grab a little bit of water. So for me, socio-environmental dynamics are basically driven and shaped and constrained by information processing in society. And maybe the way to begin to that argument is to quote Nicholas Leeuw, who basically says societies don't exchange information with the environment, but they exchange information among themselves about the environment, which is a very different thing. There are no immediate clear signals from the environment to shape our information processing. We select signals. We determine which ones we think are important. We determine what we consider our environment. We determine what we consider the problems of the environment. And we also consider what are the solutions to those problems. So it is all within society that this happens. And of course, if a society is to be adequate and functional with its environment, that basically means that the information processing at any time has to adapt itself to the dynamics that is actually embedded in. And so that is what I think is important and why we have to take into account both the externally and the internally driven dynamics of the society. So as a result, I would argue that human information processing is viewed as the societal dynamic par excellence that has created the situation that we're in, that is trying to resolve the problems we have, and that is then also subject to the illusion of control and ultimately a collapse of that particular illusion. So that co-evolution between the information processing apparatus in society and the environmental dynamic is actually the core of what we need to attack if we want to get to some sense of understanding of what is going on. Now, that information processing I have sketched in the next couple of slides, next slide, at two levels. On the left-hand side, it is the individual level. It's very simple. We are faced with a problem, we try and solve it. Solving it structures our knowledge, and more knowledge increases our capacity to treat other problems. And that increased information processing allows the creation of new problems, and so we have a feedback cycle. And on the societal level, when, as is generally for the moment accepted, people can only handle, let's say, maybe 8 or 9 sources of information at the same time about a phenomenon, there is a limit when problems become much more complicated. And the way our societies over long-term time have dealt with that is by increasing more and more brains and including more and more people. So there is also a feedback loop between the demography, the societal structure, and the information processing. So the way I see this is that you can't use the traditional definitions of information. So I've tried to find a wider one that is not as constraining to my argument. And so I define information as all that which humans pay attention to among all the impulses that their senses receive. Then the question becomes, okay, how do we select the kind of signals that we do something with? And I found a very interesting way of looking at that, which basically says, it is not a question of positive selection of what we do pay attention to, but it's a negative selection of that what we don't involve in our thinking. And I will come back to that towards the end of the talk, because it puts a very interesting, different perspective on the concept of noise. Noise is very often in science defined as sort of what hangs around a particular solution, what statistically is not part of the core of the argument. I'm going to propose a very different way to look at noise so that we actually can begin, maybe, to actually deal with it. So, learning, then, is for the long term, a positive information processing feedback that is a loop that creates order out of the unknown world. So we move from the unknown to the known unknown, those things where we have a sense that there is a problem, but we don't really know what it is, to the partially known, that is, we have some of the criteria of that particular challenge, but not all of them, to what is ultimately the closed category of that, what we consider our knowledge. So I'm also using a distinction between understanding and knowledge. Knowledge for me is a closed category that defines a particular set of phenomena. Understanding is an open category that approaches those phenomena, but that doesn't in any way, in a closed way, define them. So this disciplinative flow structuring, which is actually a term that comes from chemistry, from Categorization, but that I've adapted to the societal approach, isolates patterns, identifies and defines their perceived dimensions, and uses them as knowledge to interpret new signals and new patterns. The example that I'm giving here is the one of meteorology, a very simple one that I published in an article with one of my colleagues from information sciences, who basically says, okay, initially, people were simply going to ask, well, why does it rain? Why are there clouds? And little by little, over a century and a half, the understanding became more complex. We identified chemical, physical, spatial processes. We went from macro observations, like rain, to micro observations, like the sort of chemistry that causes some of that rain. We identified more and more signals. But in doing that, we also identified more and more dimensions of understanding. So new scientific fields emerged. And the most recent one is the modeling exercise that everybody now gets into. We also developed more and more technologies, observation technologies, analytical technologies, computing technologies. So what we now do is actually to include the societal dynamics as part of the Anthropocene in our understanding of what meteorology is all about. So what we see is a sort of a blossoming of a big tree where there are very many branches and they're all working together. So the evolution of that tree is part of what we need to think about. Now, the interaction between the mind and the environment. Because on the one hand, as part of this process, we create more and more complex images of what actually is going on, adding new dimensions, adding new problems, adding new questions. How does that work? Well, there is an interaction, and here I am anticipating, in a way, the talk of Atsushi Iriki later on in our symposium, who has worked on this much more in detail and scientifically than I have. I have approached this in typical social science way with concepts and things like that, but not with indeed all the imagery and the physical proof of how that whole thing evolved. So what I'm basically saying is that our observations are things that we interpret insofar as they resonate with our existing information processing apparatus. That is everything that we have acquired as knowledge, I would say. And part of that resonance means that we actually feel that we can treat those phenomena with that knowledge. But of course, because it is a resonance, there are always signals in that trajectory that are not part of the known knowledge. And those change the information processing structure in the mind, and thereby also do that to the environment that the mind interacts with. The main sort of theoretical approach to that is this whole concept of niche creation. And what, if I may for a moment, Atsushi refer to this in a very general way. He argues that there is a conjunction in the niche creation between the mind, the language, and the actual phenomena. I let him talk about that part of it, but I want to sort of look at some of the consequences of what that particular resonance network creates. Our human mind is, and again, I am following the work of people that I am not capable of completely judging, but seems to be limited in the number of information sources that we can actually bring together to, in our mind, conceive of a dynamic. And the number that is quoted is sort of 8 plus or minus 2 sources of information. And when there are more sources, and I said that earlier when I talked about the 2 feedback cycles, collective processing emerges. But it is also limited because communication becomes a limiting factor in that interaction between those different people involved. And so there are always unanticipated consequences of human actions. And that's where I said solutions always cause problems, sometimes far into the future. I haven't elaborated that aspect of it, but we can in the discussion if you want. So now I also, as an archaeologist and a historian, want to look at the relationship between past, present, and future. Because as human beings, as this image of Janus from a Roman sculpture actually symbolizes, we create our sense of the present in combining our knowledge of the past with our experience of the present and the future. Those two perceptions are combined. They exploit the past and explore the future. They combine the old worldview and shape the new one. To combine accepted values and ethics and ideas, that I call it knowledge, with the exploration of change to gain understanding. And that results in hypotheses that are expressed in terms of possibilities and probabilities. So over time, initial uncertainty and ambiguity give way to growing certainty, as more and more of those open categories actually get closed. So we move, and that is what I said earlier, from unknown things in our world around us that we haven't even perceived, to things where we have some sense that there is something, but we don't really know what it is. And then ultimately, we try and devise a way to look at it, and that is initially in terms of open categories, and I'll get back to those open and closed categories in a minute, and then closed categories. So once certainties come to dominate and knowledge dominates, then we can follow Thomas Kuhn's approach to looking at what then happens and how a perceptual revolution has to emerge to actually keep a workable relationship between the ideas of the society and the actual phenomena that it is living in its context. So now we get to this categorization. And there I have worked on the basis of the work of Tversky and Gatti, who in 1978 published a very interesting, for my mind, article in which they document with a lot of scientific accuracy and documentation two phases in how we create categories. They argue that initially, if we don't have a category, we look at a set of phenomena or perceive a set of phenomena, and then sort of try and emphasize the similarities to actually get a conception that gathers that information of a lot of different phenomena in a category. The category is open. What happens in the second stage of categorization is that once humans have a referent, that is a theory or a sort of concept of what the category means, they then start comparing it with new phenomena, and those phenomena very often are then different. And so it is the dissimilarity that is being stressed in the second part of this operation. Now here I have given some aspects of how those different operations work. Initially, you identify similarities in a space-time dependent sample. That is, you take a sample of the chairs here in the room and you say something about that sample. Then you go somewhere else and you find other kinds of phenomena. And so you begin to say, okay, this is not part of this particular category of chairs, it is something else. So those open categories describe groups of phenomena because they're extrinsically defined. What you get then is a second phase in which you deductively, rather than inductively, extend the categories to intrinsic, space-time independent, closed categories, describing classes of phenomena. Those are completely defined, and they can be applied anywhere in the world at any time. What is important in that process is that you selectively reduce the dimensionality of the category definitions, because you want to save part of your memory. You can't go and include in your definition all the differences of all the instances of that category. And so you selectively reduce the dimensionality of the category, and that means that you can reduce the energy involved in maintaining the memory. Those formal definitions, creating fitting phenomena and excluding non-fitting ones. And that is the work that Tversky and Gatti have worked on, and where they first define objects to reference, so that is from the object you get the category, and then you work from the category to other objects, with the second part. As a result of that, I would argue that we have three cognitive spheres that create decisions, or that structure decisions, would be better to put it. A certainty sphere, where the closed categories are, that are rooted in the past. A possibility sphere, the open categories, with flexibility to include new phenomena. And a problem sphere, where there are no categories at all, unknown or dimly perceived. So now we move over time, and in particular, I would argue from 1750 to the present, but actually this is a process that goes on all the time. What I'm saying is that as a society shapes its worldview, it has more and more closed categories. It works over time to actually close those. Now, what does that do? It actually shifts the society's general approach for understanding, which is partial understanding, to actually knowledge, which it thinks is fixed and permanent knowledge. So time is getting shorter. Precision is increasing. You work from relational to transactional social interaction, for example, which is something that begins in the 14th century in Europe. You distinguish between pure and value-laden statements, which I here will summarize as Hume's is statements and his ought statements. He argued that you could not move from sharpening the division from is to ought, but you could move from ought to is. That reverse processing, the reverse shift from ought to is a sharpening the definition by excluding the dimensions, excluding the value dimensions that are part of the ought and that Hume stresses, and remaining with the is categories that are observational. So increasing confirmed values among the population. What we get is from a relational polythetic perspectives to topical, analytic, and narrower perspectives over long-term time. Solutions, problems, and anticipated challenges become part of the society, and we have more and more closed categories and fewer open categories, and an anticipated number, and a very rapidly growing number, of unanticipated challenges. Now, what does that do? Well, it means that we are creating more and more rules, more and more institutions, more and more technologies, and that we move in our thinking on an emphasis on comprehension, understanding, to an emphasis on dealing with the environment in terms of competency. And for me, the way to illustrate that most is if you look at human-computer interactions. Some people feel that the computer should behave as they want. Other people accept that they have to behave as the computer wants. Well, it is that shift towards competency, that is routine responses to challenges posed by information, by machines, by rules and things like that, that I think has changed fundamentally in our society over the last 2.5 centuries. And I would argue that that is one way to begin to approach the ultimate causality of why we have such trouble responding, because we are now so fixed in a fixed set of competent reactions to our environment that are closed, that we can no longer very easily open those. So our worldview is more and more fixed, and our adaptability is more and more challenged. So, how come? And I refer, for those who were there, to a discussion we had last night over dinner. I would argue that this shift is part of what the anthropologist of business, who is actually right now one of the chief editors of the Financial Times, argues that every group interaction has a silo effect, in the sense that it develops particular language, particular gross category systems, and so on and so forth, which actually gives that group a sense of control. Taleb goes in the other direction. He says we have an illusion which is achieved by banishing from thinking the imponderables of the context in which the group operates. And so my sort of take on that is that Western societies have defined more and more closed categories, more and more solutions, focus onto perspectives, values, and norms from past experience, and exploit existing knowledge, stability, and rather than exploring novelty. So we exploit the past, we exploit stability, we emphasize stability, and we don't explore novelty and change. So we get a proliferation of rules, institutions, and technology. If I put it in a very different way, I would argue that if you look at ancient Greek people thinking about this, you have two perspectives. You have the Aristotelian perspective, which basically argues that stability is the norm and change has to be explained. And you have the Heraclitean perspective that argues that change is the norm and stability has to be explained. And I think we're in that dilemma in how we are thinking right now about our own future. So the illusion of control ignores the dynamic superlinearity, generating unexpected, uncognized problems. Why am I calling this a superlinearity? Because much of what science is all about is about change. But it is only in limited ways that it is about the change of change, how the processes of change themselves are changing. And that needs to be taken into account if we ever want to get out of this problem. Let's see where we are. Okay, I have, I think, a little bit more time. So, a sustainable future, yes and no. What I'm here emphasizing is the relationship between the categories and the narratives. Narratives, in more recent thinking about that in very many disciplines, are argued to be the mainstay of worldviews that societies have and apply to their environment. The oldest one that I know of is the Gilgamesh epic, but it's similar to Jason's, Odysseus' travels, and so on. It's basically a linear story that links together a number of gestalts, because that's the only way a linear story can actually refer to multidimensional phenomena. And those gestalts can be very different. And that determines the fundamental aspects of the worldviews. And the example I give here is an incomplete example, but I think a very interesting illustrative one. In Greek tradition, gods behave like humans. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, humans should behave like gods. That's a very, very big difference, and it affects the way we look at the world. So superficially linear stories resonate with that multidimensional world through those gestalts that are very deeply anchored in culture. They can be mountains, they can be sources. I recently was in Japan, where I saw hundreds of sanctuaries on a tiny island that usually create gestalts around natural phenomena in the island Miyako. So narratives are grounded in cognitive categories that are essential in decision making. And that is where I link the last little bit of the story with the present one. And for me, one of the reasons why the UN SDGs are never going to work is that they're actually grounded in a Western narrative of progress, which for most of the cultures that it's all about just doesn't apply. This is simply a graph drawn from Helbing to show how processing power, human processing power, including machine processing power, data volume, and systemic complexity actually probably relate. And so I'm simply emphasizing here the growth, almost unbridled growth, of systemic complexity. So what is needed for the survival of society? As the volume of unexpected problems grows, an increasing proportion will remain unsolved or be dealt with through unsuitable solutions. Yet, for the society's survival, you need the correct balance between closed categories that give sort of a backbone of its interpretation and open categories that are things that can be included, that can deal with change and so on. And thirdly, the unsolved problems. Now, at times, societal dynamics rely on closed categories. They make the system predictable, but when the unsolved problems exceed a limit, the society moves towards open categories, enabling change. And apart from the content of the book, but what I like very much in Jacques Monod's expression is that societies move between chance and necessity. They deal with tipping points by restructuration, but that restructuration is very time-consuming and is often initially avoided by maintaining the illusion of control. So we have a risk spectrum, and what is interesting is that as humans interact more and more frequently with those problems they encounter almost daily, the short-term de-risking of those problems often causes a longer-term risk barrier, which then we call a tipping point, by ignoring the accumulation of longer-term risks. So the challenge is that if the narrative is high-dimensional, it includes many values. If it's low-dimensional, it reduces the group's representation of reality. The proliferation of closed categories has basically reduced the dimensionality of Western perception of reality. The gestalts have been simplified, sometimes to caricature. Since the Industrial Revolution, technology has been a major driver. And technology is a very interesting, static way of actually processing information. A car is a complex dynamic, but we have come to the point that the driver only has to consider him or herself with accelerating, braking, and directioning. All the other dynamics have been excluded. And so we have simplified the car to something that is only including a very small part of the total dimensions involved. So for the West, in my mind, what we need to do is to open up a set of those narratives that determine our worldviews and that includes the scientific categories. We need to reconsider science as not the only solution. And I'm not indicating any particular other solution that societally would be unacceptable. I'm simply saying we need to start thinking about it and asking questions about how the science is actually partly responsible for the sustainability problems that we're having. So the question then is, well, is it possible to have other truths? And that is where we get to information technology. One of the most interesting experiments I read about recently is astronomers who have had IT map the universe. And they come up with a set of categories that are nothing at all to do with the categories we used to look at the universe. So the question becomes, well, what alternatives are there to our vision and what can we do with that? Can we go from an Aristotelian to a Heraclitean perspective? which favors change. And one of the things that I think is really important in sustainability research is that we need to look at how, in that research, we have actually created stability rather than not dealt with change. We have deliberately created over the last centuries maybe, a kind of stable sense of what the world is all about. So, first thing to do, of course, is if we know that we're digging a hole, is to stop digging. And so one of the things that I think is important here is to realize what has happened when the academies, the Royal Society, and so on, were founded in the 17th century. They had all kinds of ideas, but the criterion for membership of an academy, and therefore the criterion for membership of the scientific profession, was actually that you had to prove what you said or demonstrate what you said. Well, that has meant that most careers of scientists became entirely focused on the relationship between the present and the past, because they couldn't do that for the future. And so we have a very heavy bias over the last 2.5 centuries in looking at that relationship between present and past. So when I get all kinds of complaints that we can't say anything about the future, I would argue, and it's a very weak argument, but I think it is still the only one I can use, to say, well, if we had 2.5 centuries thinking about the future, we might actually be a hell of a lot further in doing that than we are right now. So we do have to face the future and concern ourselves with it at all levels, scientifically, politically, and so on and so forth. And that is where I think complex system science begins to fit. I'm not arguing that it's something that will solve these problems, but studying the emergence rather than the origins of our historical phenomena, combining history and unpredictability, learning from the past about the present and for the future, to me, is the way we need to go. Change is permanent and irreversible. The illusion of stability is to be explained. The flow of matter, energy, and information is the structure rather than the structure conducting the flow. Then comes a very interesting economist, this man Jens Beckert, who in a book entitled something like Imagined Futures, develops the idea that the economy is actually driven by our fantasies of the future and the role we actually make for ourselves in that future. And so he argues that the narratives we create and that shape our behavior, I would say, are actually those projections into the future of our own roles. And he implicates the future, therefore, in shaping the present, rather than do the reverse. And that is an important changeover. So we don't have here a fully constructivist perspective, as the future is not controlled or controllable, but we at least have a change in direction of our vision, of the way we look at things. And he, in the book, actually elaborates a vision of the economy that is based on this particular premise. And it's a very, very interesting exercise. So when you then move up, and you basically say the exchange between imagined futures and present conditions shapes narratives. Present conditions are formulated in interactions between the past closed and the present open categories. Now we get to when this might start going wrong. And it's basically that all of this is based on trust in the knowledge, trust in the established system. And if that trust starts to wobble, then we are very seriously in trouble. So long-term second-order dynamics can quickly change short-term first-order dynamics. That leads to the loss of trust, and what may seem unimaginable can relatively rapidly become reality. So we get the absence of trust that can destroy confidence and change positive into negative feedback. Some of those changes are known in history, and the one that I like most is what happens with the 14th century plague epidemic in Europe, when the whole perspective on time changes. Before that, human existence is part of a long-term process in which death and life alternate. At the end of that whole period, at the end of the 14th century, we begin to see the emergence of a very fundamentally different attitude to time. Because what is now becoming important is not the long term, but the shorter term, the interval between birth and death. That creates a very different way of structuring social relations. And in particular, it makes more and more relations no longer based on long-term relationships, but on topical interactions, the exchange of money, for example. You see a similar thing at the end of the 18th century, in the lead up to the Industrial Revolution. So we must, is the lesson for me, actively search for ways to break open the closed categories that are behind the illusion of control. And I would argue that in that sense, artificial intelligence may be a danger in a more short term than climate change, but that's another story. So how to change narratives? There are essentially a couple of things that come from this PowerPoint. First is the Bonchek statement, that unlearning an approach that one has already acquired is more difficult than learning a new one. So the persistence of terms like capitalism and progress are logical in that perspective. And then I come back to Kahneman's quote that I gave earlier on, that people believe the reasons because they believe in the conclusions, and that it's very difficult to undermine the conclusions by giving reasonable reasons. So as a conclusion of that, I would argue there are three ways in which you can begin to change narratives. You can crush them by brute force, which is what happens when a very major company takes over a smaller company and wants that smaller company to become ideologically part of the bigger one. You can also try and create a completely different narrative to replace the illusion of control. And that is essentially what Buckminster Fuller has proposed when he says it makes no sense to break down what exists. It's much more effective to create something new and then convert people to the new. And the third solution is one that is currently, I think, more and more proffered as one that could help, is to change an existing illusion by tinkering with the narratives that actually sustain it. And this is a complex process, and I will not get into any of the details of this, but I give a couple of examples. The crushing by force is, for example, the way IBM has taken over a number of companies and reshaped itself, reshaped its narrative, reshaped its functioning. That's not possible unless you have, I think, a disequilibrium in power, and if you have the possibility to actually take action on that. In a sort of a encounter with one of the leaders of the F2F movement, she complains about the fact that their movement can draw attention to what is going wrong, but is not capable to devise and promote an alternative. She calls it a glass ceiling. I think that that is part of what we're talking about here, that problem awareness can be favored, but solution implementation cannot be favored unless there are very different power considerations. The second one is to build a new model. And the example that I'm taking here is that of the company in the United States called Echelon, which devised a new distributed control approach to heaters and things like that. And the paper that the chief executive, Maxfield, wrote with one of my colleagues in Santa Fe Institute basically argues that generating the new approach is relatively easy. But to actually convince people to use that approach is a huge expenditure of energy and finance. They've tried it out. In the US, it hasn't worked. Honeywell and the likes were the strongest. In Italy, it has worked. They actually have now a huge application of their distributed control system in the Italian information processing industry. So what it needs is very strong intellectual and practical leadership, a coherent focus, huge resources, and an intellectual fusion of a very wide range of disciplines, so that you can overcome the trend towards competency and reinstitute comprehension of what is actually going on. And so the third one is this. No, here I get this is sort of a, between brackets, a thing about noise. So we exclude noise from our observations. If you were to say that the signals that now are considered noise are actually signals that are waiting for a theory and a paradigm to explain them, you come to a very different attitude about signals. And you actually get to a very different attitude about noise. And you have to start exploring how you might be able to deal with noise on that basis. And one of the things that is important there is that you have to, that assumes multiple futures, of which only one has been identified in our reductionist narratives, but that we need to go back to those multiple futures. We can go on about that, but the last one is the tinkering approach, which is something that particularly our colleague Sheng has worked on when he tried to identify a number of the roadblocks, and Jan already talked about those roadblocks, that are actually making it very, very difficult to change. And so based on that and his identification of moral hazard, debt, overconsumption, capital and labor as categories, you become to think that what you need to do is actually change the category system, and that might be done by tinkering. Now, he can answer to that. He's in the room somewhere, right there. And so we can talk about that later. But another thing that is important here is the relationship between the top and the bottom of an organization. Human societies will always bump into a complexity limit. And I gave that with the graph from our colleague a moment ago. So the relationship between the top and the bottom of an organization is very important. Human societies will always bump into that complexity limit. Unintended consequences will always overwhelm a society's whole information processing system. And by keeping the society small, that is what Ostrom does, we actually create the polycentric approach. Now, the identification of what is changeable and what are fixed parts of the narrative is a very interesting sort of analytical approach. And one of my colleagues has worked at that by going through interviews that describe narratives and basically look at any statement what the relationship is between the expected and the observed entropy. And that gives a sense of the degree of fixedness. Because if that relationship is very narrow, you can basically argue that a lot of the knowledge and the science and the structure of the information processing is related to the past and a known past. Where it's much wider, you actually get a sense that some of the open categories are beginning to play a role. So that's a historical approach. But then I will end that part by basically saying, this is one of our main problems that we have in democracy, because it makes narrative changing incredibly difficult. And then, do we have still energy to summarize? Yeah, I have 5 minutes. Miracle. Okay. I would argue that human information processing systems are always on the edge of criticality. The upper limit of processing is closely and dynamically linked to the number of available cognitive dimensions in society's knowledge system. The balance between unknown, open, and closed is essential. Time is a critical factor. take you long-term time, or do you look at short-term time? Do you look at second-order dynamics, or you look at first-order dynamics? But in general, we move from comprehension to competency. And our societies have undergone 250 years of that. And that is why, in my mind, we are now stuck where we are. So if we look at the distribution of information processing, some people process more information per unit time than others. That leads to siloing and dominance of rapid processors. That elite section of society will be more prone to cognitive reductionism. It develops an illusion of control, loses interaction with the remainder of society. And when there is no longer a connection, the society will likely fracture. I am very impressed by Gurish's book, who shows how this has happened in our societies from the Arab Spring to the present. He is an ex-employee of the CIA, and that is a bias that comes through. But I think his historical and theoretical argument is very, very sound in that respect. So depending on relative proportions of open and closed categories and narratives, we can see the emergence or the non-emergence of tipping points and societal problems. And then what we need to do is essentially to reopen the closed categories, to change the balance between the closed and the open ones, and to crush existing narratives, to develop alternative narratives, or to tinker with narratives are three of the solutions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this, I would say, profound overview of ways of thinking about the illusion of control, to deal with it, to apply it to the sustainability of our planet, and all the other things that you said, which I will not summarize. I will not be able to summarize. It's rather than that, I would open up the floor to questions, to discussions with Sander, but I will also open up the, this sounds a little bit funny, but the world, because the world is following us on Zoom. So people anywhere around the world who have questions or remarks to Sander, please do so. We have people in the back, technicians who will know want to interfere. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So who is the first that I can give the Helga?
You're very much focused on the change from comprehension to competence. And yet I feel we still have the need to comprehend.
Of course.
We still have the need to understand. So I'm wondering whether this change should be more expanded, because you made it seem like, you know, we should leave the comprehension behind and move on to competence, where probably what we have too much in the world today is efficiency. You know, everything is driven by efficiency. And, you know, it trumps resilience and so on. And so this is just one thought that it triggered in me. The other one, you know, I would like to come to the defense of modern science in the sense that from the very beginning on, to fight against the illusion of control was central. Because coming out from, you know, alchemy, Newton was still practicing alchemy, as we know. There was always the fear you can take in by the senses of what you see, and it's an illusion, and you have therefore to set up experiment. I mean, this is why we have peer review. You know, as faulty as it is and as perverse it has become, you know, you need this control of an illusion, but there's this deeply seated fear in science. We may become, you know, fall into the trap of illusion. And maybe this has also been, you know, run by, you know, this drive for efficiency. And technology makes this very easy because, as you say, technology has a way of working. And if it works, it becomes very simple. And this is what we are looking for. This makes life easier in many ways. And yet, as you say, we give up many other things that are not captured by it. So it's just a reaction to the very rich and thoughtful talk that, I really need to go deeper into it, but thank you very much.
Well, let me at least begin to take away what I think is a wrong impression that I'm sure I created in the way I pronounce things. I am not arguing that we have to move to more competency. I am arguing that we have to return to more comprehension. I sketched what I think is the last 2.5 centuries of dynamic, which has moved very deliberately towards the competency. And I regret that. And I think that that is what is bringing us to the current tipping point in many ways. And when I sort of halfway down mentioned that I have a feeling that there is a relationship between the evolution of science and the evolution of sustainability, that is one of the things where I'd like to look much more closely at those kinds of things. So that first part. The second part of what you say is indeed a huge dilemma. I am not arguing that we have a way out or that we know how we're actually going to deal with this. What I've been trying to do in this talk is give a different context to a lot of what science is doing. I basically see our current science as a path-dependent development over the last 2.5 centuries. And in that development, the scientific system has made certain choices. Certain papers have been judged as absolutely fundamental, and others as much less so. That has created, in my mind, an architecture that is limiting our thinking. And so it's not a question of trying to abolish science or to do away with the scientific problem and the reasons for the scientific system that you're actually arguing. But what I am thinking is, yes, we are insufficiently aware of how the evolution of the last 2.5 centuries has made a number of conceptual and value decisions of which we are insufficiently aware, and that if we were more aware, we would actually be looking at them differently.
Right.
Yeah, please.
Sean.
I think your characterization of what you delivered in the last paragraph that you've just offered now is as close to perfect as anyone is likely to be able to find in a single paragraph. Let me offer 2 dimensions, because I think we're facing challenges, many of which you've referred to, and some of which Gillian Tett has referred to in her anthropological exploration as well. The key question is whether our, for want of a paragraph, I'm going to use shorthand, our cognitive limitations, our ability to process complexity with our cognitive apparatus, make the sort of outcomes that you've described inevitable. If we are constrained to produce oversimplified representations of what we have observed, and then postulate those as either hypotheses or received truths, and then act on the basis of those insights, then it seems likely that most relatively modern, quote unquote, civilizations at least affected by the European Enlightenment, hence 250 years, are going to make roughly the same mistakes. Not in all ways, but roughly, because it's an inherent cognitive constraint. There's no doubt that by formulating what Popper would have argued was a falsifiable hypothesis, the essence of a scientific statement, we are excluding a range of other possibilities in the formulation of the hypothesis. I'm not sure I know of a better way of advancing scientific propositions as long as one retains recognition that one is excluding what one has perceived at that moment to be noise. And the idea that noise might be a set of data that currently lack an explanatory narrative is a terribly important intellectual exercise. Related to that is then the Kuhnian proposition about paradigms, it seems to me. Because as Kuhn observed, a paradigm not only postulates what probable hypotheses are, it postulates what questions we ought to ask for the purposes of research. And that is inherently constraining further. So we have two fundamental challenges, it seems to me. The one, cognitive constraints, the second, the way in which we, I think, have seen paradigms emerge, and the way in which we approach the development of even new paradigms in science, even when the experimental data, Newtonian science at the end of the 19th century, has proved to be ineffective in respect of our ability to be able to explain certain things. E equals mc squared can emerge, and so can Heisenberg and Planck. But a new paradigm has the same limiting constraints as the old paradigm. So the challenge back to you, just rephrasing your rather eloquent paragraph in a slightly different way, the challenge back is how do we get past that, particularly as we are facing a gigantic global challenge of trust at the moment. No scientific group outside of probably the European Enlightenment currently accepts our approach and our conclusions in respect of many issues as being appropriate and fit for purpose in the present era. So have you any thoughts on how we get past
Well, in general, I very much agree with your argument. But what I try to do is to raise the problem of the awareness of the result of that path-dependent development. And I don't have solutions. I think, but we will get later in the symposium probably to some questions about that. That we may be able to begin to discern a way to approach things that considers multiple potential futures and to evaluate those futures against each other. That might be one way in which we can help at least become more aware of the challenges that we're facing. But it's very clear, for me at least, that at present we are not there yet. And that we must work very hard to get there. That's all I can say.
By your statement about the role of categories, open, closed, and I think that's very important. And related to the fact that we just limited by our cognition that we can focus on 2 or let's say about 8. So now we have used AI to help us to solve the issue. I think that's pretty, we should worry about that, because what AI, it makes some categories, and that's based on the past. So that's dangerous if you consider the important role of just having open categories, and especially since AI is fed by data from the past.
Exactly.
So basically, I would say nothing is as conservative as an AI system, and we have to look towards the future. So what's your view on that? Is it helpful, or is it?
Well, first, I had a little sentence in there that I am very happy that a number of the people who are at the root of AI are now beginning to be aware of the problems. In my book in 1920, I basically argued that the information revolution is a more immediate problem than the climate issue. And so then, to get more closely into your argument, of course, the difficulty is, well, what do you consider AI and what should it be doing? You're quite right that the current manifestations, the ChatGPT and all of that, are basically looking only at past information. And therefore, I do not think that in the current situation, AI can become what it claims to be, that is artificial intelligence. I think what we can say is that it's machine intelligence, but that's about as far as it goes. Just like rats have their intelligence and elephants have their intelligence too. So I am clearly not a specialist in this, and there's a lot of stuff that I would need to master to be able to make a coherent argument. But I do believe that we are getting a new tool. And there's one archaeologist many, many years ago that said something like about, he used the image of these things you had for little kids where you have holes in different shapes and you have sticks that you hammer through them. He basically said, if you give archaeologists a new hammer, they'll find all kinds of ways to use it. I think that is what is happening right now. And I don't think we're at the end of that evolution. But at the same time, if you follow a book like Susanna, whatever her last name is, about the surveillance society, and you begin to become aware of how the big corporations are operating in this domain, yeah, there is reason to be worried. There's no question about that. For me, at least. It's,
okay.
No. But...
Okay. There's a lady over there. Can you say your name, please?
I'm Jasmin Link from Universität Hamburg, Germany. Thank you very much about your talk. It has been very, very interesting. And I would like to emphasize the point that you didn't mention path dependence in your talk, but already mentioned it twice in your replies to the questions, which sort of took you to the meta level of your talk, in which you stated that you said that you actually tried to describe the path-dependent process of science and the stability that is fixed by this path dependence in the process. And so I'd like to ask the question whether that might be a perspective to look on stability versus change and consider process dynamics that can take us into the future and how to actually change things, not to use the same like variables all the time, like narratives and definitions, categories, but rather look at process levels, like processes, path-dependent processes, extrapolating processes, not linearity, but exponential processes. And
well, a couple of things, simply not as an excuse, but this is one of 4 papers around the same topic that I'm working on, or that I've worked on. And so the path dependency is very clearly part of my thinking, and I have actually published on that as well. So that is something that I fully integrate, and I'm fully happy with your suggestions there. Now, the difficulty is, okay, we have created, let's say, a skeleton worldview in each individual topic. In a book that is to come out at the end of the year, which I'm not at all the author of, but one of my colleagues in Holland is the author. He is the first one to basically make the link between the worldviews of different cultures and their senses of sustainability, for example. We have not done that. We have a problem in the sense that the natural sciences have a universalist sort of pretension, I would argue, and that therefore that is very limited in its applicability across the world. I would argue that there are many systems and theoretical systems which can explain a lot of the phenomena that we are dealing with, but we are stuck with a particular set of explanation. Now, how to get from that to a different approach. Well, yes, that's theoretically ideal and would be very nice if we could do it. But one of my arguments was that because of the shift to competency, we actually have a huge barrier there because we have a baggage that is directed in a particular set of ways. And in order to do what you would like to see do, we need to shed that whole baggage. And I don't see that as something that is a feasible, no, not, maybe not a feasible solution, but at least a very realizable situation. I mean, what is also part of all of this is this sort of volume equation that once you spread a particular idea to a very large community, there's going to be an incredibly more difficult thing to eradicate or to change than if it is a small group. And we are now, thanks to colonization and globalization, to a system where these ideas have been so widely spread that I think it would be, for me at least, in my lifetime or a little after, absolutely inconceivable that that would change. So in that sense, I'm actually very pessimistic.
Yes, Martin William. My question sort of extends what you just said.
Okay.
You, at some point later in your talk, that I very much enjoyed, excellent talk, you specifically talked about Western thinking, and I think much of your argument is built around that, rooted in Aristotelian philosophy rather than Heraclit, which I think is a very important point. My question is, to what extent you were there, obviously, and you just talked about that, other ways of thinking in the world, and the Aristotelian one that we inherited from our Greek ancestors, I would describe as, it's built around setting goals, building models, building theories, and then deriving your actions based on those models and theories and goals. You build discrete categories, and that's the whole point of science. Other cultures that you refer to, and I'd be curious about that book you talked about, look at it very differently. They don't look with theories in that sense, and they look at processes as at relations, as things that are in between, but not necessarily categorized in a discrete way, between things where the reality changes between polar opposites. And the Chinese way of thinking is probably the most extreme, but there are obviously other cultures. Would you say that the challenges and the problems we're facing with the Western ways of thinking we've built over the last 250 years or so, these challenges are very much rooted in our way of thinking, and other ways of thinking that are described are much systematically much less exposed to those challenges, and also maybe less exposed to the illusion of control, because they don't build their thinking around the concept of control in the same way. And then the question is that just a philosophical, interesting observation, or does it relate to hard issues that you can much more easily explain to policymakers or business leaders, like competitiveness? If competitiveness in the future is built on the ability of different economies to successfully deal with climate change and come up with solutions that might be exportable to others who were less successful, is that a very serious challenge to competitiveness of our way of thinking? your point of, you made a point about that I loved because of work in the energy industry about de-risking causing problems longer term. I've heard many institutional investors who are very excited about renewable energy, but then the main point is, well, we need others like policymakers, taxpayers, to de-risk these things so we can actually invest. Are they doing that to really preserve a system of finance that might be more Aristotelian than Heraclit based? So that's an example.
Let
So-
me begin by saying it's only in the last few years that I've been approaching some of the Eastern ways of thinking. I've had the opportunity for the last few years to work for a very limited amount of time, but in a very interesting way in China, also in Japan for a longer time, and I've just come back from Japan. So there are different ways of thinking about this. And one of the really interesting sort of stories about the problem with our categorization is the story about the man who has a stick, and the stick has two ends, and he wants to separate the two ends. And so he got the stick in the middle, and then he's got four ends. And the Chinese approach is then that both ends are part of the same, whereas we create an opposition between the ends. And so that is just one element of a different way of looking at it. And I've actually written a couple of papers in Japan about these kinds of issues. So I think that for the moment, there is indeed a merit in looking at those systems and seeing in how far they can contribute to our thinking. There is a movement in the complex systems community that actually does that, and we will get a speaker tomorrow. Is Brian tomorrow or he's on Wednesday? Who is actually a champion of that. And I hope, I don't know, he's talking from California, whether he will actually be able to sort of help us with that a little bit. Jan has worked with some of his Singaporean colleagues on some of those differences as well. So I'm aware of those differences. Now, I am not sufficiently into this whole subject matter to really give you an answer on the last part of your question. I am not in the business community, and I am not in the sort of de-risking community. The only thing I'll say is that I am at Arizona working with a retired top leader of British Petroleum who is aware of a lot of these issues, and that we have been discussing them. But I'm not going to give you an answer. I'm just not capable of that and not placed for that.
Yes, I cannot see you very well, but
Okay,
can you
yeah,
hear me?
hi.
State your name, please.
Pratik, from Yadav, we have been in conversation, and thank you for a very fascinating talk. The question in my mind is, and of course, and I do very much appreciate this focus on moving away from competence, predictions, control, but then it's really then about how do we validate our choices, right?
Yeah.
And it's a big problem, I think, and then what makes me even more pessimistic is like even in the East maybe where there were different traditions, this illusion of control or this modernity ideal has taken hold so strongly that very difficult to see. Yeah, that also makes me pessimistic.
Well, that last part I very much agree. I think colonization and globalization have basically sort of steamrolled over many, many useful ideas that have no longer the right of expression, I would say. So yes, that pessimism I share. But I also want to say something else, and that is that, of course, yeah, it's fine to now look at different systems. And they may be able to help us with the problems that we currently have, but they have their own problems. And so ultimately, it's not a question of saying, well, this system is better than that other one. It is at most a question of saying, well, if we are dealing with this particular problem, this might be a helpful way to think about it, okay? And not further than that. And that is something that I think is insufficiently part of a lot of what the environmental sciences are doing. And as you know, I've been part of Rockström's effort about the sort of the limits of what the Earth can do. And in the end, now, what is it, 15 years later, I have a sense that it was useful at the time, but many of the problems that it has raised are only now beginning to emerge and should actually be tackled. Okay, and so that is where my personal perspective, which really comes from the social sciences and the historical sciences, is very sort of keen to at least equilibrate and balance out those two kinds of ways of thinking. But the same goes, for example, to your example with the Chinese system. The Chinese system has its own problems. And so we need to not try and sort of say, well, this system is better than the other. We need to basically say, well, here we have a problem. What can we do about that particular problem? And the issue remains that as humans, we will always have a partial view and there will always be unintended consequences.
I understand there's a question.
Yeah, we have one from the chat.
Okay.
Brian Daniels writes,
Yeah.
I liked your point that collective computation incorporates more information than an individual human can process. Is there a role for technology, e.g. machine learning, to help do this useful in a way that humans cannot understand? Or do you see this as causing too many unintended consequences due to a lack of comprehension? So be helpful.
Okay. First, my regards to Brian. And it's an interesting question. I have actually worked on this a little bit. And my problem with all of this is that, yes, of course, the technology can help. But the risk that we're running right now is that the technology goes its own way. And we are no longer capable of steering the technology. Now, I'm not saying that that steering is necessarily positive. All I'm saying is that I foresee a very major break between the understanding that is created by the machine learning and the understanding that scientists have developed over the last centuries. And then the question is, well, what do you do? And one of the things that I think we should be doing, and it's only very partial, but is we have generally, when we find a solution, we don't evaluate that solution against the options that were not chosen. And I think that is a really important addition to our way of making those choices. I would argue that very often we have simply, because it sort of proffered itself, gone for a particular solution, and we have not sufficiently evaluated the long-term unintended consequences of the alternatives that were open at the time. And so that would give us a little bit more directionality, maybe, in where we're going.
Okay. Actually, we've run out of time. Is there any other urgent question that needs to be addressed right now?
We've got time. We've got time.
Otherwise,
3 days, so.
It's not an urgent question. I just feel, you know, we should not end this fantastic talk in a sort of, you know, pessimistic mood. and you know, you challenged us. Let's look at the noise, and perhaps we find new signals in the noise. And in my view, we need to create better conditions for people to do that.
Absolutely.
And also responding to what was asked before, you know, the way how our views of possible futures, we have lost the future in a sense because we are informationally and emotionally overloaded by the present. We have these technologies that keep us busy almost 24 hours, and we have no time even to imagine future. So we also have to think about what are the conditions that are necessary so that we start to look what are possible signals in the noise around us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very good. I want to give one addition to that. Whenever I'm sort of asked in a meeting like this, what my personal feeling is that I am short-term pessimistic and long-term optimism. I think the issue you're raising is we don't have the time anymore because we don't make the time anymore to actually think about the long term. And that, I think, is a very risky proposition for a large part of what is happening right now in the world.